Hello again, I am Blunty, and I made a video about the surprising way in which Nintendo are doing their backwards compatibility with Switch 1 titles on the Switch 2. Because it's not just pure hardware like they used to do in some other cases, and it's not pure emulation like they do elsewhere. It's actually some pretty clever stuff. But today I'm not talking about that. Today I want to address a far more important topic about this functionality. That is, its functionality. And the question is, are your Switch 1 games actually going to look worse on the Switch 2? The answer is, yeah, they actually might. Because, and I mean this honestly, not in some hater-baiting, reaction-hunting, click-thirsty way, I am not trying to spread, unfounded fear and uncertainty or misinformation here. But there is a pretty decent chance at least some, if not a fair pile, of OG Switch games will actually legitimately look worse on the Switch 2, particularly in handheld mode. And specifically, this will likely be an issue particular to any Switch 1 games that do not get special Switch 2 compatibility or upgrades or patches or Switch 2 edition kind of stuff for Switch 2 from their devs and publishers. And it comes down to the fact that the Switch 2 has a 1080p screen on it, while the OG Switch has, of course, a 720p screen. And that, believe it or not, is a pretty big issue when it comes to correctly upscaling the visuals of your games. For some perspective on this, and to talk about how Nintendo have handled this issue in the past, because this is a long way from the first time we've been slapped with this particular problem, let's take a step back to the transition between Nintendo DS and the 3DS. The Nintendo 3DS's main screen has a resolution of 400 by 240 pixels. Technically, yes, it's 800 by 240, but you don't actually perceive that because that is for the parallax 3D mode. So each of your eyes only really sees 400 by 240 images, and in 3D mode, the left and right frames for the game are of course rendered at 400 by 240. So yes, for every practical purpose we're talking about, it's a 400 by 240 screen. Its predecessor though, the Nintendo DS, used a 256 by 192 pixel screen. And like the Switch 2's ability to accept Switch 1 physical game carts, the 3DS could slot in DS carts and run them basically hardware natively. So when it came to the backwards compatibility of actually running a DS game on the 3DS's screens, and ignoring the window boxing that comes along with displaying a 4:3 image on a widescreen, that is a 25% scaling factor in each axis. And this is a disparity that meant it was impossible to cleanly scale the image in a pixel-perfect way. Which meant in practicality, DS games on the 3DS always looked a bit more blurry, a bit softer than they should. It's a lot more obvious to the naked eye than it is pointing a camera at these screens, but those of you who had a 3DS surely know what I'm talking about. But Nintendo recognized that was an issue, and there was a trick for solving that. By holding the start button as you boot a DS game on the 3DS, you could force it into a pixel-perfect mode after all. And it did this by literally just using the pixels it needed, and window boxing and letterboxing. It looked a bit awkward, sort of sitting there in the middle of the screen, but it was sharp and clean. And for some games, playing it this way versus the upscaled way was a pretty big difference to how they presented. This was also a problem for things like the Game Boy and Game Boy Color Virtual Console titles, of course, because their native resolution was 160 by 144, and it was an even more awkward scaling factor of just over 66%. But you could also do the pixel-perfect tricks with those as well. And they even came with a frame to help stop it looking quite so silly and tiny in the middle of the screen there. So, that's how Nintendo have dealt with it in the past. Back to today, though. The original Nintendo Switch had a screen resolution of a nice industry standard 1280 by 720, aka 720p of course, and it could output over HDMI in the dock at 1920 by 1080, the familiar 1080p standard. Annoyingly though, 720p and 1080p also do not scale in a pixel-perfect way. It is in fact a 50% increase in both dimensions, which is why 720p on a 1080p native screen looks kind of blurry and soft. It's not quite as obvious as with a DS game on a 3DS because we're dealing with a lot more overall detail to begin with, but it is pretty noticeable. And while any game presented this way looks a bit softer, and maybe that's okay, you can get away with that, It's a bigger issue for things like UI overlays and any on-screen text, because fine detail, high contrast stuff like that scales especially badly from 720p to 1080p, especially text, which becomes far fuzzier and far more difficult to read. It was for issues like this that you will find some of those older school consoles that did sort of render out in 720p to display on our 1080p TV screens would often render the UI separately at native 1080p, so it was nice and clear even if the game was a bit fuzzier. But this is one of several reasons Switch 1 games had two rendering modes, one for docked play to a 1080p output over HDMI, and another profile they used while handheld. It was low resolution rendering and designed for the 720p screen, including the UI elements, which again would often use the same trick of rendering at native 720p even if the game itself was rendering below that. So, when it comes to Switch 1 games on the Switch 2, this arrangement will likely be an issue, depending on how the Switch 2 handles Switch 1 games in handheld mode. If it does things like the 3DS did, and just runs the game raw and farts out an extremely simple upscale of the 720p handheld output mode, including the UI, direct to the 1080p screen, your Switch 1 games are going to look soft and a little blurry, and the UI and text especially is going to be very noticeably soft. And again, a lot of these games weren't even running 720p native to begin with. They were just upscaling to 720p for the screen. Monster Hunter Rise is a great example of this. It ran at 960 by 540 in handheld mode, before then upscaling that to 720 for the Switch 1 screen's native resolution, and it also did that trick where the UI itself was rendered at native 720p, so it was nice and clean. So you can now imagine it's gonna look pretty trash if you're on Switch 2, upscaling a 720p image and a 720p UI from the game to the 1080p screen on the Switch 2 when the game has already been upscaled from 540p to 720p in the first place. Two separate upscaling steps stacking on top of one another. It's not gonna look good. This won't be an issue for Switch 1 games that do receive those updates, those patches, or full-on Switch 2 Edition DLC-style add-ons. Job 1 of even the most basic versions of those patches will surely, presumably be to make sure the games run at an appropriate native resolution, or at least don't double upscale like in my Monster Hunter example. So in the case of that game, if it does get a patch, and right now there is nothing at all from Capcom on that front, by the way, Capcom, please, hello, can we get some news on this? But if it gets a patch, one of two things are going to happen with it. Either they will adjust it so the 540p internal render gets one step upscaled to 1080p for the Switch 2's native screen resolution, which will actually look pretty damn sharp, like really sharp, because that would in fact be a pixel-perfect 100% upscale, because, of course, 540p is exactly half of 1080p. Or they could simply use the extra power the Switch 2 has in overhead and render the handheld version native at 1080p instead. Which, by the way, on the original Switch hardware, this game doesn't even run at 1080p native in docked mode. But this, of course, would look the best. It's the best option, but it's a choice against battery life as well, because it will chew through more power and swallow up more battery along the way. So it depends on where Capcom would prioritize such a currently theoretical patch for this game. There are also Switch 1 games that, unlike Monster Hunter's 540p internal render for handheld, use other resolutions for internal rendering before output upscaling, and all of those other choices do not scale cleanly to 1080p in a pixel-perfect way. So those present slightly more complicated choices about whether to patch a native 1080p mode for handheld or adjust the internal render to something that would scale more cleanly. There's also the opportunity, of course, for such patches to utilize the DLSS upscaling that Switch 2 has available at its system level, which would significantly improve how the scaling looks at various internal resolutions. Again, using Monster Hunter as the example, that 540p internal handheld render using a flat 2x DLSS to scale it to 1080p would look fantastic. In fact, unless you go pixel peeping, it would look damn near native 1080p, really. Especially if they also take the opportunity to make any such patch render the UI at native 1080p over the game. Because even DLSS has a bit of trouble with upscaling text and whatnot, so it's always better to render that separately and natively. But all the options like that do require the developer and the publisher to decide to spend money doing that. So unfortunately, unlike the DS to 3DS situation, there is no clean answer here. Every single game has the potential to look basically the same, or perhaps blurrier, or even noticeably cleaner, depending on what they were rendering at internally on the original Switch. There is also the chance that we get the option to run Switch 1 games, even those without specific patches, in their docked mode even while handheld with the Switch 2. It should have enough power for that. In this way, their normal docked mode 1080p output that they would ordinarily use for HDMI from the dock, alongside whatever single-step upscaling from their internal resolutions would ordinarily use if not running at 1080p native, would be used for the 1080p native screen directly, basically tricking the original Switch game into thinking it was running in docked mode. But again, with that option, it's a choice against battery life. But wouldn't it be cool if Nintendo used a similar trick, just like they did with the DS to 3DS transition and the pixel perfect mode we could use with a special key press as we boot up, so we could choose which option we ran Switch 1 games at on the Switch 2 in handheld mode. Leave the decision up to us if we want to chew through more battery power and have a 1080p effectively native experience, or go with the handheld mode and whichever set of compromises that might entail. Outside of all of that, if you're in docked mode, all Switch 1 games that do run in backwards compatibility without special patches and the like should look basically identical as they always have, because they'll still be pushing out the standard 1080p over HDMI they always have done in docked mode. And of course, if you've got your Switch 2 connected to a 4K TV, which I think most people have these days, right? That's still fine, because the reason 4K is a thing, the purpose for that really odd-sounding 3840 by 2160 resolution number, the reason that was chosen to standardize for high-def stuff was because, unlike 720p to 1080p, which caused so many scaling issues back in the day, 1080p to 2160p is a pixel-perfect 2x upscaling job. So even the most dead basic scaling in the world will still look nice and clean. I want a very quick sidetrack. If you're curious, yes, if you hadn't noticed by now, that is also how we wound up with 1440p as one of our standards today, sometimes called 2K, because that is exactly double 720p. So, yeah, I know, all of this can get a bit confusing for the less nerdy types out there. Lots of numbers and what ifs and alternative options and stuff, but hopefully I've helped demystify at least some of this and put it into a context that's a bit easier to grip for the, let's say, layman out there. Short answer is, better hope your favorite Switch 1 games get at least basic patches if you're the type of gamer who likes to play in handheld mode. Otherwise, it's a bit of a dice roll on if it will look noticeably worse on Switch 2 in that handheld mode. But docked mode will be basically identical presentations across the board, no problems there whatsoever. And of course, those games that do get special patches will look noticeably better than they ever have done before in handheld mode, even if it is just a basic patch for resolution rendering and scaling adjustments and to fix that UI problem. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty. Thank you as always to the patrons, and I will catch you next time.